Hi folks, Adam B. Levine here. We're back from New York with exclusive talks, panels, and interviews to share with you. Regulation and compliance are some of the most common buzzwords in the Bitcoin entrepreneurial space right now. But how do you comply with rules that don't yet exist? Today's release is a double feature that starts with my 12-minute talk with David Landsman, Executive Director of the National Money Transmitters Association. After that, we dive right into the 50-minute panel entitled Legal and Regulatory Issues Facing Virtual Currency Businesses from the main stage at Inside Bitcoins. Moderated by Trade Hill's Ryan Singer, that panel features Jerry Brito of George Mason University, Jacob Farber of the legal firm Perkins Coie, Patrick Griffin of OpenCoin, Greg Chevet of the Genesis Block, and James White, a director at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Our release schedule for the next few weeks might be a little more crowded than normal, so stay tuned for episode 30 to release sometime before Friday. If you have comments, questions, or topics for the show, please visit letstalkbitcoin.com/reddit to be directed to our new listener interaction subreddit. We've had a lot of activity here so far, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say. If you enjoy the content from the conference that'll be releasing over the next few weeks, please donate Bitcoins or Litecoins at letstalkbitcoin.com. This trip was out of pocket, and your support allows us to cover future conferences in the same fashion. We have 3 or 4 more scheduled before the end of the year. Also, thanks to Media Bistro for putting on such a great event with Inside Bitcoins. David Landsman is the director of the National Money Transmitters Association. He joins us this morning to talk about kind of some of the complexities of compliance in a world where there aren't many set rules. David, thanks for joining us on Let's Talk Bitcoin.
Good morning, Adam. Thanks for having me.
Like I said, this is sort of a polarizing space. You come at this from a compliance viewpoint rather than from a cryptocurrency viewpoint. Now that you've been in the space for, a little bit of time and have looked around, can you give us an overview of where you think that cryptocurrency fits as it relates to regulatory compliance?
The NMTA, the National Money Transmitters Association, our core membership is the state licensed money transmitters of the United States. So that's the population that we're trying to uphold and protect. And we're looking forward to welcoming a whole bunch of new licensees into that field of membership. But the impression that I get is that the vast majority of people who have been working in virtual currencies and Bitcoin up until now were not really totally aware of the fact that they were going to be entering this space. On the other hand, you have FinCEN, who just made this March 18th ruling, which is great for what it is, but it's just trying to fit a brand new technology into the same old categories, which is not going to work.
Are Bitcoin businesses money transmitters?
Well, unfortunately, the closest analogy I can come to is a traveler's check. If you look at it that way, you could say that virtual currencies are like traveler's checks, but on steroids. And every state in the country regulates the sale of traveler's checks, I think, except maybe 2. The sale of traveler's checks is considered a money transmission activity. The problem is that there's going to be a huge population of people trading Bitcoin for their own account. Up until now, in the definition that was put forward by FinCEN, I can't see any difference between an active Bitcoin trader and a financial institution. And when I say financial institution, I'm talking money service business that's subject to the full array of requirements of the Bank Secrecy Act, the Patriot Act, compliance programs, everything.
So the guidance that came out, kind of the broad interpretation that I think I hold, and I think a lot of other people within the community held, was that it specifically sets aside and says that if you're not doing this as a business, then you're not a money transmitter. So is that different from your understanding of the guidance?
Well, what they tried to say was if you're using it for an underlying transaction, if you're using Bitcoin to pay for a good or a service, they consider you to be a user. They completely ignore the process you have to go through in order to get the Bitcoin. You have to buy them. Well, are you a financial institution just for buying it? Let's suspend our disbelief for a moment and say, no, okay, you're still just a user. And the people that you buy them from are exchangers, if we can tell the difference. But what happens when there's an active market from person to person? The whole point of Bitcoin in particular is that it's a decentralized system. First of all, there is no liability of the issuer. From a consumer protection standpoint, it doesn't fit any paradigm that we have from before. But from a regulatory point of view, the first thing a regulation has to do is define the population of people that it applies to. And I think FinCEN is going to have a big problem defining the population of financial institutions based on what they do. People who buy and sell Bitcoin in huge quantities, for a lot of people, How are you going to tell the difference between somebody who's doing it for himself versus somebody who's doing it as a business? Does he hang a shingle out? Does he advertise to the public? Well, that's great, okay? If you have somebody who advertises to the public, then you can pretty much be assured that he's a financial institution and treat him as such, okay? But what about people who just get a reputation and they start doing huge business? Where are we going to draw the line? I don't think FinCEN really has the answer for those questions.
So we've had guidance, but no real clarity on the rules in the long term. Again, you've been in this space for a while. How long can a situation like this continue? Is there a historical precedence here that we can look to for some sort of guidance?
Well, I've been talking to a lot of people, in particular in the Bitcoin Foundation, because they're already so active on this. They have 3 separate committees that are wonderful. One of them on education, one of them for governmental affairs, which is, interfacing with regulators, and another committee called Law and Policy, I believe, which is going to talk about what kind of changes we can make to the law. And I think that's necessary. But in the meantime, it's a very practical matter. If you happen to be an entrepreneur who's been planning on starting a Bitcoin business in the near future, you really have to check this out and you have to take it seriously. You have to look at your operation and through the eyes of FinCEN, actually, and find out if you're going to be considered subject to these rules. And chances are you will be.
Earlier in this conversation, we talked about how there's a need to register, there's a need to comply with different state-by-state rules. Licensing generally is done on a state-by-state level. I read an article this morning about a gentleman named Aaron Greenberg, who's a fintech entrepreneur from California. He basically was driven out of business before he ever got started with an innovative financial service because the cost of coming to market in financial services right now is quite great. He estimated that in order to comply with the 48 states that have such requirements, it would cost $7.8 million in surety bonds and $71,000 in application fees alone. Regulators say this isn't a barrier to entry, but rather that it's consumer protection. I mean, where do you feel like this falls on that spectrum?
Well, I'm afraid that Aaron Greenspan got off on the wrong foot with the California authorities. I'm not sure what kind of a business plan he submitted, but basically they're going to ask for a surety bond, and that's going to be commensurate with the size of your business plan. So if you're talking about selling large numbers of volume or large volume numbers, they're going to ask for a high bond without even bothering to look at the fact that your outstanding liabilities are going to be zero because everything's extinguished immediately. But there's a few misconceptions in those figures that were given. If it were $7 million worth of surety bonds that would be required for many, many states in total, your premium that you would pay perhaps 1 or 2% of that amount. So it would be like $14,000, okay, a year. That would be your commission to the broker who's providing the surety bonds for you. The surety bonds are going to be issued to you based on your personal credit and the riskiness that's assessed by the surety broker. The fees for applying for state licenses, I guess, are going to be a lot more than $7,000 if you're going for all the states. So there's a lot of misconceptions and misinformation out there. It's really best to talk to the professionals and to come to our compliance conference on August 14th in New York City. NMTA.us is our website, so please check out all the information there. But really, it's a process of education and getting very specific. Looking at each state, you cannot make any assumptions about any given state because if you don't have to get a license, you sure don't want to. So some states may or may not decide that you're regulable based on your physical location. Even if you're doing business with their residents, although most states will require a license, some states won't. And some states still haven't gotten up to the point where they even want to regulate anything to do with Bitcoin, regardless of what location you're in. It really pays to be specific.
There haven't been many specific actions actually taken against Bitcoin companies or exchanges, but there have been lots of bank accounts that have been closed. Again, it's the sort of thing that looks odd to me because it feels like if these are issues of compliance, then it should be a regulator that is saying this. But more often than not, the action is coming just from individual other financial institutions that are just withdrawing support. I mean, that seems like a situation that is dangerous for everybody involved because there's no set standards. I mean, can something like that continue for very long?
Well, unfortunately, it can, and it has, and it's disastrous, but it's a quiet disaster. Nobody really speaks about it because there's no constituency that has a voice, unfortunately. And this is the reason the NMTA was founded, was because of the banking problem. They've been closing money transmitter accounts for a long time. And if anybody in the government ever tells you that they do not expect the banks to be the de facto regulator of our industry, you have to call them out on that, because it's just not true. The government absolutely wants the banks to be the choke point. From the very beginning of the Bank Secrecy Act, they looked upon financial institutions, specifically depository financial institutions, as the choke point with which they're going to control the movement of currency among the entire population if you're going to go through a financial institution. And of course, with special attention paid to transactions in cash, which now we see that Bitcoins are like cash on steroids. So it's really the perfect regulatory storm. And unless we change the laws, nothing is going to happen. You're going to have huge deposits to leave with the bank in order to make it worthwhile for them to even bother looking at your account, unfortunately.
So this is a complicated problem. And as you mentioned, you're putting on a conference in Manhattan on the 14th of the month. Is that right?
That's correct, Wednesday.
If an entrepreneur who's interested in, having a compliant Bitcoin business wanted to attend that, what would they see at your conference? What's the focus, broadly speaking, besides the regulatory part?
There is nothing besides the regulatory part. It's an entire, and that's why it's unique, I think. It's an entire day devoted to discussing this issue and in all its complexities. The people who come there are going to get a sense of the history of this problem. So a lot of the questions that you're asking now, they really have to be understood only in context. So that's what they're going to get. Connie Fenchels, our program director, is a former deputy director of FinCEN. Kicking off our conference is Jim Fries. He was until recently the director of FinCEN, and he's going to take us through the history of the regulation of money transmitters in general, which now Bitcoin and virtual currencies are a specific case of. So the person who comes there is going to get a chance to ask their questions. They're going to get a chance to hear the way regulators think. And that's the most important thing. If you're going to be dealing with regulators, you have to understand how they think.
And so if somebody wants to investigate that further, you gave the website before. Can you give it one more time?
Sure. It's www.nmta, as in National Money Transmitters Association, .us. We have the registration link right up on our website. And if you use the secret discount code Bitcoin, you'll get $100 off. Right now, it's $445 minus $100. Your price is $345 now, up until Sunday night when it goes up. So please buy your tickets now.
David Landsman, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
More than 300,000 users and counting trust blockchain.info. It's a Bitcoin wallet service and a wealth of Bitcoin information, and it's completely free to use. With a blockchain.info wallet, you'll get the convenience of a web wallet and the security of a desktop client. Blockchain.info is also a block explorer. You can use it to see Bitcoin transactions in real time, check the balance of any Bitcoin address, and view many handy Bitcoin charts, all for free. See what they have to offer today at blockchain.info.
Hi, this is Jason King, founder at Sean's Outpost, and you are listening to Let's Talk Bitcoin. Sean's Outpost is a homeless outreach in Pensacola, Florida, and we are proudly powered by Bitcoin. To date, over 13,000 meals have been fed to the homeless in our area, all purchased with Bitcoin and through the generosity of the cryptocurrency community. Read more about us at SEANSOutpost.com. Food, shelter, Bitcoin, everybody. Sean'sOutpost.com.
The moderator for this next panel is Ryan Singer, who's the president and COO of TradeHill. He's a passionate leader in open source software and was a co-founder of the Open Document Foundation. Prior to TradeHill, Ryan spent 2 years leading projects for the Stanford Peace Innovation Lab. So let's give him a big round of applause. He's going to introduce the panelists.
So there's two interesting pieces of news today related to what we do on this panel. One of them is that a bunch of companies in the space, including mine and Patrick's and a bunch of my clients, got together and announced that we'd like to be a part of an organization that wants to synchronize our views on know your customer and AML policies and things like that, with the goal of eventually becoming a part of a regulatory organization in the space. It's called DATA, Digital Asset Transfer Authority, and there was an article about it in the Wall Street Journal, in American Banker, and in the Huffington Post. And so that's an interesting thing to look into. The other piece of interesting news was Thailand's central bank just told a company in that space that in Thailand, they think the purchase, sale, and international transfer of Bitcoin is illegal. And that's an interesting first move, too. Thailand's famous for doing moves like that. It's illegal to compete with the Thailand banks to do microfinance, for example. So, interesting trends happening. Anyway, I'm going to let the panel introduce themselves. We're going to kind of go in order. Everybody's going to talk about their little thing for 5 minutes or so. Some of them are experts in different aspects of regulation, legal compliance. And then we'll open it up for questions, and we'll have kind of a panel discussion, and we'll see what's interesting.
I'm Jim White from the Government Accountability Office. For those of you who don't know who or what the Government Accountability Office is, it's GAO. We're part of the legislative branch. We do tax policy analysis for Congress and also oversight of the Internal Revenue Service. I'm a director at GAO. We just issued a report on virtual economies and virtual currencies. That report was requested by the Senate Finance Committee. Both the chairman and the ranking minority member requested the report. They were interested in learning more just about the tax compliance risks associated with virtual economies and virtual currencies. I want to thank you for the invitation to be part of the panel today. It's traditional for government types like myself and academics to start out with a disclaimer at these things. I have 2 disclaimers, not one. First of all, the report that we issued speaks for GAO, not me. And second of all, I'm not a tax advisor. If you need tax advice, you need to talk to a tax advisor. Our report covered 3 topics, essentially. One was what's known about the volume of Bitcoin transactions potentially subject to U.S. tax, the types of transactions that might be subject to U.S. tax, and finally, what IRS is doing to provide guidance on this. So first topic on the volume of transactions. There's little known about the volume of transactions that might be subject to U.S. tax. There's some data about Bitcoin transactions and the volume of Bitcoins in circulation, the volume of transactions, but that information's global. It's worldwide. It doesn't break out U.S. information. Furthermore, the U.S. information isn't broken out by what might be subject to U.S. tax. So based on that, there's virtually nothing or no reliable information about the size of any tax compliance problem right now. And I'll come back to this when I talk about the recommendation that we made to IRS. The second topic is on the types of potentially taxable transactions. Basically, there are 2 types of tax obligations under the U.S. tax code for people. One is paying the tax on income that you earn, and the other, and this applies mainly to businesses, is a third-party reporting requirement. A lot of businesses have requirements to report income of people they deal with as a third party. So, for example, employers have to report wages they pay, and they report that on a W-2, and IRS gets a copy of that W-2. Similarly, now settlement organizations such as credit card companies have to report the receipts that the merchants they deal with are making. Their reporting requirements for barter exchanges. In the course of our work, we dealt with IRS on some of these reporting requirements. They hadn't thought a lot about this, but we had some conversations with them about what might be taxable and so on. The general rule is if it would be a taxable transaction or a reportable transaction if it was carried out in dollars or yen or some currency like that, then it's very likely that it's also a taxable transaction or a reportable transaction if it's carried out using Bitcoin. And that's a general rule. Again, the specifics to a particular case depend on the facts of that particular case. So the bottom line is that a Bitcoin miner, therefore, might earn taxable income mining Bitcoins. A merchant who accepts Bitcoin in payment for a service or good that's sold may be earning taxable income. The report also highlighted some of the risks, and these are really uncertainties associated with the tax consequences of Bitcoins. And some of those risks, one is there's just a lot of uncertainty out there about what is taxable income. So is it, if you receive payment for services, is that considered wage income or is that barter income? When is an asset that goes up in value a taxable capital gain? How's the basis calculated for estimating the capital gain? When do third parties have reporting requirements if transactions involve Bitcoins? All of this is uncertain. And that led us to the final part of the report was our recommendation to IRS. Based on what I've said so far, both the fact that this uncertainty exists about what's taxable income, what the reporting requirements are, and combined with the fact that we really don't know much about the size of the problem, we made a recommendation that IRS put some informal guidance on its website as opposed to more formal guidance. The advantage of this is that it's cheaper and easier for IRS to do it. IRS agreed with our recommendation. They've told us they're in the process of developing some informal guidance. I don't know when that will go on their website. And with that, I'll stop.
Thanks, Jim. That's actually really exciting that they've agreed and that that's coming. I hadn't heard that yet. So next up, Jacob works for Perkins Coie. Perkins Coie represents us and many of my clients. Most of the companies in the space have retained them to try and figure out how do virtual currencies apply to existing laws. And they're among I'd say that the law firm that's probably done the most research in the area.
Thank you, Ryan. Is this on? Good volume? Yeah, it's on. All right, so I have been given the unenviable task of going through the regulation of virtual currency in the United States in 5 minutes. And, you know, for somebody who knows a lot, this will be ridiculously basic. To somebody who's new to the community, all you're going to hear is a list of topics because that's basically all I have time for. And I figure even just doing that, issue spotting for people will at least get, if you're not familiar with it, will at least get you the vocabulary, and then you can start asking questions and follow up with people in the community. So I know it's going to be rapid fire and unfortunately devoid of deep content because we don't have time for it. This was in a Bitcoin primer that circulated a year or so ago. The legal classification of Bitcoin is still unclear. It could be considered a commodity, a currency, a financial product, or legally equivalent to World of Warcraft gold. The answer is it's all of those, and I'll talk about why that is. We also know that it isn't prepaid access federally, except that maybe it is sometimes. It's stored value, which really is prepaid access according to some states. It's probably not a security, but except it can be made into one. So what does all that mean? I'm going to divide the talk into federal law and then the states. I'm not even touching outside of America. It's not because I'm America-centric. It's literally in 5 minutes. I can't even do justice to that, much less international regulation. The landscape began to crystallize the regulation of virtual currency and Bitcoin in March of this year when FinCEN, which is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, issued its guidance on virtual currency. It's the arm of Treasury responsible for anti-money laundering policies. And the guidance defined virtual currency and then basically said that it was going to regulate virtual currency under the existing definitional scheme for a money transmitter, under the Bank Secrecy Act, which is the anti-money laundering law in the U.S. There's a class of financial institutions, money services businesses that have to follow anti-money laundering policies. One of those categories is money transmitter, and that's what FinCEN decided virtual currency was. It went on to define a whole bunch of terms that literally have no basis anywhere in the statute or the regs that it then used to talk about virtual currency exchangers and administrators. And there's been a fair amount of uncertainty created by some of those terms. I don't have time to go into it now. You see the bullet up on the screen. Happy to answer questions. One of the big ones is that while the guidance more or less clarified how exchanges and gateways are going to be regulated, it left some big unanswered questions about users and miners, suggesting the possibility that they might be money transmitters too. One thing to keep in mind, there's a lot of emphasis when people talk about the guidance about these terms that FinCEN created and whether they made new law or not. It almost doesn't matter because nothing in the guidance changed the definition of money transmitter in the Bank Secrecy Act regulations, and that's what you got to come back to whenever you're faced with a question about whether you're regulated under the guidance. I want to point out one key here. Basically, money transmission is when you take value from a person and you send it to another person, or, and this is key, another location, and I've emphasized it and bolded it, because that's how FinCEN gets at an awful lot of what happens in the virtual currency space. You take dollars from somebody, you send value back to that same person, say Bitcoins, but since you've sent it to their Bitcoin address and not the bank account that they sent you dollars from, you've sent it back to another location, ding, money transmission. If you are a money transmitter, you have to register with FinCEN, you have to have an anti-money laundering policy. Most of the major exchanges and gateways are or are coming into compliance with this. It's not that hard compared to, and I'll talk about this in a second, what you have to do if you fall under state money transmission regulation. I'm just going to tick off a couple topics really quickly. Right now, there is no regulation of virtual currency by the CFTC, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission. They've signaled they very well may in the future. It's clear that virtual currency is a commodity because basically under the Act that governs the CFTC, everything is a commodity. I'll simplify. But it doesn't matter, and if you're not engaged in things that the CFTC has jurisdiction over, like options, contracts, and futures and derivatives, it's not going to matter. If you're doing those things, it's likely at some point the CFTC will come calling. There's also the SEC, continuing the federal alphabet soup. Right now, I think the general consensus is that virtual currency is not a security. You can package it in a way that you can turn it into a security, but if you're just buying and selling Bitcoins, you're probably not trading in a security, although I would say that's only something that the industry is reasonably comfortable with being true. There are a whole bunch of other federal regimes. There's consumer lending laws. There's the FTC, which will get involved if there's consumer fraud, which of course there will be. I think at some point we can expect them to pop up. That's it for federal regulation of virtual currency. It was like 3 minutes. States. Most states regulate money transmission. Their perspective, unlike the federal perspective, is consumer protection, not anti-money laundering. They do it under a whole bunch of different frameworks. Some refer to money transmission, some talk about payment instruments, some talk about stored value. And it matters because, and I have a slide on each of the three, and I'll just tick through them. Basically, you have to look at the language of each of the statutes to see if they apply to virtual currency. For example, sometimes the statute defines the subject of money transmission law as being money and makes clear that by that they mean real currency, legal tender. And since FinCEN's guidance told us that virtual currency is not legal tender, in those states, at least under the letter of the law, you're probably not engaged in money transmission. So the details matter. We've gone through, we've analyzed the 50 states and the District of Columbia, and you can put them into groups. There are some states we think you're probably safe to operate in, some where there's a question mark, and some that are no-go unless you go and get a money transmitter license. As a lot of you know by now, that's an expensive and time-consuming process to go and get 50 state money transmission licenses. People say $1 million in a year. It's a little rough, but not by more than it's not off by an order of magnitude. 2 quick points on the states. At least 2 have said it's not just if you're operating in our state, but if you're sending currency to somebody in our state. So from outside of our state, we view ourselves as having jurisdiction. Very possible that others might take that position as well. I'm going to back up a slide to note the second point. There are at least 3 states. Let's see if I can get there. Yes. New Mexico, South Carolina, and Montana, no money transmission regulation. Let's see, we were there. So what does all this mean? You got to look carefully at the regulation in the state you want to operate in and do the parsing of the regs of the statute. Where you think you need a license, you better go get it. Businesses have gotten cease and desist letters. And it's pretty clear that if you're operating a virtual currency business in a state that regards itself as having regulatory authority over it, they will come to you and get you to stop until you come into compliance. One thing to keep in mind, again, a lot of the more established gateways and other businesses are figuring this out. There are options. You don't necessarily have to go and get your licenses in every state. There are ways of partnering with licensed money transmitters and with banks, which are exempt from the money transmission laws, to structure your offering so that you technically have the money transmitter or the bank doing the money transmission piece of it, and you're functioning legally as their agent, even though you're continuing to really, it's your offering. Those are complicated structures to put in place, but they're doable. It does mean more, and this is a common misconception. You don't have a bank partner for this purpose if you just talk to a bank into giving you an account, right? Even that's a hurdle for some companies in the space. That's not enough. That really doesn't get you out of the money transmission kettle. Last two slides. What's next? I think in the near-term future, I think the FinCEN guidance, as much as it's created consternation and confusion, is going to be a fairly stable structure, at least in the near term. I think most of the exchanges and other businesses have said, I don't like it, but I know how to get compliant. At least I have a roadmap I can follow. There's still these open questions from miners and users. I think the other agencies will pile on, but I don't think it's going to be that some other agency grabs jurisdiction from FinCEN. I think you're just going to have more agencies regulating specific aspects of virtual currency. And finally, I think the states are going to continue to probe at the extent of their jurisdiction. Last slide. Well, I can be done. The long term, just a couple observations. I think that the regulators will take a wait-and-see approach. I don't think that necessarily there's going to be, in the next couple, 2, 3, 4 years, a new regulatory regime put in place. I think if there's mass adoption, though, of virtual currency, which is what I think most of the regulators are waiting to see if it happens, then you could have a relook and maybe a new scheme put into place. But I think in the near term, what we know is that we're operating under at the federal level at the money service business regime, and at least we might not like it, but at least it's a known that we can deal with. End of talk. Sorry it was so rushed.
So if you have a Bitcoin startup, your regulation and compliance strategy is one of the most important parts of your strategy, and you need to hire someone like Jacob, and there are 5 or 6 of them floating around the industry to help you do it. It's required. You have to do it before you raise money. You have to do it before you start operations. And a key early operational hire will be your compliance officer. This is very, very important, and you've got to do it before you launch your business. Moving on, Jerry Brito from the Mercatus Institute at George Mason University. This is kind of the flip side. So Jacob's all about, how do you comply with existing regulation and how do you make sure that your business isn't going to go to jail for running it. Jerry's going to talk more about how do you influence the direction that that's going.
Well, thank you, Ryan. Thank you all for having me here. I thought what I'd talk briefly about is as the regulators that Jacob discussed start looking at Bitcoin, the importance of education in DC and in the states, actually, as this moves ahead. And I think that the current law and regulation does not really envision a technology like Bitcoin, so that's why it exists in a bit of a legal gray area, right? Bitcoin does not exactly fit into any of the existing definitions or any of the existing regulatory buckets that we have. And it's difficult to make new buckets, right? So what regulators try to do inevitably whenever we see a new emerging technology is try to fit that new technology into an existing bucket. And when you do that, you tend to make mistakes, right? Especially when you have radically new technologies like Bitcoin that don't fit neatly into existing buckets. So, I've heard many people say that they believe that the governments will never allow Bitcoin to compete in the existing sort of financial space or compete with the monetary system. And maybe down the road, I think that might be a problem, might be a situation where governments do want to exert that kind of control. But I think that right now, certainly the situation that I see in Washington, D.C., is that of policymakers not so much trying to exert control, but of just trying to figure out what the heck Bitcoin is, and trying to figure out what regs apply, and how these regs, how the regulations apply to this new technology, right? So it's not a matter, to me, it's not a matter of whether different parts of the Bitcoin ecosystem are going to be regulated or not. I think we know that they're going to be. I think it's pretty clear. And I'm not saying, by the way, that I think these regulations are necessary or wise. It's just stating a fact. The question is, do we want regulators to do as little damage as possible in the process of fitting Bitcoin into their buckets or creating new buckets? And I think at this point, it is the policymakers' ignorance that can do the most damage. And to me, the example A number one is the FinCEN guidance that you were discussing, Jacob. First of all, it's about virtual currencies as a whole. And that is what they're regulating, is virtual currencies. And that is an umbrella term that includes both decentralized currency like Bitcoin and also centralized currencies like you might have heard of Liberty Reserve. And whenever I speak to either folks on Capitol Hill or different enforcement agencies, they talk about virtual currencies. That's what their interest is virtual currencies. And so you have to draw that distinction for them. Now, the FinCEN regulation defines persons that are potentially subject to really significant regulation. And you had the definition up there, you know what a user is, an exchanger, an administrator. With exchangers, it's very clear that they are subject to FinCEN registration and compliance. With users, it's much less clear. It does not explain how the law applies if one obtains Bitcoins not to purchase goods or services, but to do something else with it, for example, send a remittance. And miners are, sort of the most unclear, right? Are miners administrators as defined in the FinCEN guidance? Well, there are no administrators in a decentralized currency, so that's why the guidance had to have a separate section about decentralized currencies, by which they meant really Bitcoin. And it says that a miner who mines Bitcoins and then uses them to, quote, purchase real or virtual goods and services is considered a user, not subject to regulations. But if the miner sells the mined Bitcoins, quote, to another person for real currency, or its equivalent, then they do qualify as a money transmitter subject to regulation. And so right now, I'm reading the guidance as suggesting that miners really need to comply with FinCEN regulation, which, as you said, can be quite onerous. Again, I think some folks think the government is acting maliciously here, that they are doing this to hamper the growth of Bitcoin. I think it's probably just mistakes made out of ignorance, right? I think that if FinCEN had given notice and taken comment on these rules, they might have been able to put out more sensible rules and really had a more improved product. And on that note, I would note that personally, I think that the guidance probably could be challenged successfully in court because they introduced new law, and they did that without issuing notice and comment, which is required under the Administrative Procedure Act when you create new law. The FinCEN regulations define, these are regulations that pre-existed all of this. These are promulgated according to the APA, define currency as a currency of a state. And FinCEN guidance says, well, we call that real currency, and then it develops this new concept that it calls virtual currency, and it sort of predicates the entire guidance on this new definition of virtual currency. So again, while this definition of currency, that is what they call real currency, was adopted through rulemaking, the new sort of substantive concept of virtual currency and convertible virtual currency exists only in the guidance. So again, a problem that could have been avoided had they taken notice and comment. So at Mercatus, the Mercatus Center at George Mason, what we try to do is to be a bridge between ideas in academia to real-world problems in the policy space. And so we're trying to engage FinCEN, but also other regulators and folks on Capitol Hill who have shown interest to tell them that they need to start engaging with the community and just explaining what Bitcoin is. So to that end, we are publishing a primer, a Bitcoin primer for policymakers in a couple of weeks, which basically explains what Bitcoin is and what the potential and the challenges are. We have been briefing the Senate Homeland Security Committee, who has been very interested in Bitcoin. They potentially will have hearings on virtual currency in the fall. And we have conducted courses for Hill staffers on Bitcoin. And we're working with the Bitcoin Foundation to get them more involved in DC. And a bunch of other stuff that I will stop now, but I'll be happy to answer questions. Thanks.
By the way, the Mercatus Institute's doing all of this really fascinating research as a nonprofit. They do take donations. If you're a fan and you're a fan of how it's influencing the regulations, you should donate.
And we just recently started accepting Bitcoin. So there you go.
Which makes it very easy to donate. Bitcoin is it's an easy way to pay. Next up, we have Greg from the Genesis Block. The Genesis Block is one of the first long-form research and analysis groups to emerge in Bitcoin. As a result, they became very early thought leaders, and I think everyone I know is subscribed to them.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for having us here today. So as Ryan said, my name is Greg. I'm the managing editor of the Genesis Block. The Genesis Block is a research and data firm in the digital currency space. So we write about everything from trading and regulation to mining and protocol updates. And we also offer a suite of data products for the community. So my background is I started out as a fixed income analyst at Citigroup, and then I started a payment software company before starting the Genesis Block, most recently. So I want to hopefully use my background with the experience with regulators and also my experience in Bitcoin to hopefully offer some context for a lot of people here in the Bitcoin space and highlight a couple of things that we get questions about a lot. First of all, Jerry, I totally agree on the idea that regulators or innovators, particularly technical innovators, tend to see the things that are different and unique about what they're doing. Regulators tend to bucketize everything into existing regulations. That said, what the FinCEN rules that applied to Bitcoin exchanges are not new regulations. Money transmitters, people who take value or any substitute value and act on it, by the direction of somebody else. That's been the definition of a money transmitter for a long time. There are definitely some new definitions that entered into that guidance, but at its core, it's not particularly different than anything that's existed for many, many years. So a couple of things in particular that I wanted to talk about in that. So when Bitcoin businesses are setting these things up, what you have to realize is that getting the licenses, which is expensive and it takes a long time, that is the first step in the process. Over the period of time that you're conducting your business, that's when the actual regulations come into play. Your business has to comply with those. They have to actually occur in your business. But there are a number of ways that you can reduce the load on a young company to try to make this a little easier to do. I know that, so TradeHill partnered with a number of people. MeCard, I believe, handles some of your, there are people who handle some of the compliance issues that if you partner with them. There are companies already, there are Bitcoin exchanges who have partnered with people who have existing licenses and are acting as an agent of those people. So there are people who are stepping into the industry with 50 states certified to be as money transmitters in 50 states as an agent of an existing principal, as it's known. And so the beauty of that is you can step in very quickly. The difficulty is finding somebody who trusts a Bitcoin exchange with their licenses, which is extremely difficult to do, but it's happening. So there are ways to outsource a lot of the difficulties of this for a young company. The second thing I want to talk about is miners in particular. So the FinCEN guidance, and so actually Jerry just read a quote, but actually Jerry, you substituted a couple key words there that I'd actually like to clarify. So, and I say this not to be adversarial, but to point out a lot of the confusion that we try to address. So in the FinCEN guidance, it says that a person that creates units of virtual currency, et cetera, and it goes into what Jerry was talking about. So Jerry had substituted the word mining there, which a lot of miners, which for person that creates the virtual currency. And that's a common substitution, and it's something that's been largely debated in this space. The stance of our firm and of a number of lawyers that we talk to is that miners would actually not constitute as money transmitters because miners, for people who understand the Bitcoin protocol, do not create Bitcoin. They are the first recipients of Bitcoin. They help provide a service of payment processing in the Bitcoin infrastructure, but they do not actually create the currency. So to define it as a person that creates units of the currency as a money transmitter, that's simply not a miner. I mean, the reason I bring that up is because if you are falling within the regulations, then it can be to your benefit to act above, in line with the law, right? So as Jim was saying, miners should expect to be taxed on their income. So if you're going to be taxed on the income, I would, and again, I'm not a tax advisor or a lawyer. You should talk to them, but set up a business entity, write off the investment, right? Take advantage of the tax structures that many businesses take advantage of every day. So if you're spending $50,000 on mining equipment that may or may not have positive ROI, well, if you set up an LLC and take pass-through losses against your personal income, there's a lot of ways to stay above the law and use it to your advantage. So don't be afraid of regulation necessarily, and if you can find ways to play within the structure that can be to your benefit. And the third thing that we've seen pop up a lot, if you're going to be funding a business, so you could go the bootstrap route, which is try to earn revenue and grow from there. You could go the investment route with venture capital. Two other things that have happened a lot in the Bitcoin space that I want to address real quick. One, it's different methods of crowdfunding, and there's an important distinction that needs to be made. One is rewards crowdfunding, where you are pre-selling a product or some sort of reward for helping you get a business off the ground. The other is selling unregistered, publicly traded securities, and that will trigger a lot of problems for people, for a series of regulators, particularly the SEC. And so we've seen some regulation about this and some prosecution of it in just the last week. And people think that because it's a new technology, because it's not dollars, that they're going to be immune from the felony prosecution of selling unregistered, non-exempt, publicly traded securities. That's simply not the case. Actually, just in the interim, we saw a Colored Coins commercial was playing on loop, and there's a cartoon chameleon with a cigar saying, "Now you can sell your own bonds and stocks." Not if the SEC has anything to do with it. So you might want to double check that before you necessarily go down that road, whether or not it's technologically capable. I'll stop there, and happy to answer any other questions.
So I'm going to let Patrick works at OpenCoin. They're the company behind Ripple. And then after that, I've got a couple of questions for the panel, and then I'll open it up to you guys' questions.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. Here we go. So my name is Patrick Griffin. I'm part of the founding team of OpenCoin. We've developed the open source payment network called Ripple. And I want to offer everybody in the room here a slightly different perspective on what these distributed systems are really all about. When we talk about Bitcoin and we talk about Ripple, we talk about Colored Coin, the inherent obvious focus tends to be on the currency. Virtual currency is what grabs the headlines. But I think if you scratch a little bit more and you look a little bit below the surface, what was really going on here is that these are protocols that can convey transactions. These are transactional protocols that can simply confirm transactions without a central authority. That is the big innovation of Bitcoin and Ripple, is that this, for the first time in kind of the history of electronic transactions, these systems have figured out how to bring the confirmation process from a central server or central entity out another layer to the level of the network, where now the network collectively is acting to confirm transactions without an authority. And what that means is, since there's no network operator, there are no network operator fees, there are no middlemen that get involved in the processing of a transaction. And I would posit that there is nothing inherently contradictory with a low-cost distributed financial system and the actions and efforts of enforcement. The current state of the industry, so really I think the big takeaway here is that these protocols can really be utilized for clearing transactions of any sort. Whether it's Bitcoin, whether it's US dollars, this is really just about clearing transactions in a more efficient and global way. So when you apply that logic that these protocols are really about clearing transactions, not necessarily about the currencies within them, you can start to look at these protocols in the framework of perhaps prepaid access and apply the same framework that exists today under the current regulatory regime on issuing prepaid access, taking deposits, conveying those balances and those values across a network. So a strong corollary, I think, to Bitcoin and to Ripple is probably something more closer to SWIFT or VisaNet or Nacha rather than to the US dollar. So what's currently being done at the state level is that there's some uncertainty, I think, within this space. At the state level, we still don't have any guidelines, any guidance. At the federal level, we have received some guidelines from FinCEN. So we are operating certainly within an environment of uncertainty. Beyond that, I think, as has been echoed, I would echo this. Some of the voices on the panel have described some of the lack of complete understanding of how these systems work from a regulatory perspective. So given that we have both uncertainty on the regulatory side and uncertainty on the side of the businesses utilizing these protocols, I think it's safe to say that the industry collectively needs to be very proactive on setting standards, creating best practices, and what we can do today is implement strong KYC standards, strong onboarding standards, something that looks a lot like current banking onboarding standards. There are already companies that are utilizing services of background check providers like Jumio and GB Group and Ideology to sufficiently onboard customers and comply and set up strong AML and strong BSA and strong KYC standards. What needs to be done and what remains unclear on how to resolve this, but the industry really does need to look to SWIFT and U.S. government action on applying the travel rule to these protocols, making sure that we have visibility into the identity of a beneficiary of a transaction, setting up strong standards for sharing information about the beneficiary of a transaction. And that, I think, is what remains to be done. So implementing strong KYC standards coupled with strong know your counterparty standards, and then bring that into a public ledger framework, that's very powerful for law enforcement, and I think that's something that law enforcement can really get behind.
It's a great point, and this is something that has come up a lot in our discussions with regulators and with our discussions with our lawyers. Is knowing the final counterparty is very, very powerful, and Bitcoin and Ripple are allowing for the first time the idea that you can know the transactions and know the counterparty without necessarily a direct reporting. So it's potentially an incredibly valuable tool for law enforcement instead of a threat. So opening up to some questions. My first one's for Jim. Jim, I think me and a lot of my colleagues and competitors and clients really understand, when we get Bitcoin in, we value it at market rates the day we got it in, that's income. When we sell it, if we sell it for more than we valued it at, that's a gain. If we sell it for less, that's a loss. I think, the taxes in terms of how to do it with our own firms is pretty clear. The question, especially since a lot of us are running like merchant processors or payment processors or prepaid access issuers, is what kinds of thoughts should inform our reporting strategies? And what does the GAO and the IRS want to see from us in terms of what information we disclose to the government about third parties?
Yeah, I think you're right. There's uncertainty on both sides. There's some uncertainty about what constitutes taxable income. There's definitely uncertainty about the third-party reporting requirements. And right now, there isn't any IRS guidance on either one of those. And again, that was the basis for our recommendation. By the way, I forgot to add, our reports on our website, the website's gao.gov. If you search virtual currency, you'll be able to easily find the report.
Looking forward to reading it. Does anybody in the panel have questions for the other people?
I wanted to just address what Greg was saying. Greg, you mentioned that miners are not subject to regulation because they do not make coins and issue coins. They're the first recipients. So I wrote about this a while back about the uncertainty around the FinCEN regulations as applied to miners, and I had a producer for the Stossel show write to me and say, hey, I followed up with FinCEN after his command, and I asked them, just to be clear, does this cover miners? And the response that he got back from FinCEN was, quote, this is quote from FinCEN, miners, if they are in the business to be miners, also need to register. Average Bitcoin users are likely unaffected by our guidance. So FinCEN seems to have an opinion about this. I would have to go back and pull the transcript, but I'm pretty sure that I've heard the director of FinCEN, Jennifer Shasky-Calgary, mention miners specifically. So I don't think we can say with any certitude that miners are not subject to the regulation. I think the best that we can say is that there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding the application of the regulations to miners.
Definitely. Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that we see in this space is as they define these new terms, they're subject to change, especially because what we see though is that, so what I was using is the language that was in the FinCEN document. And so FinCEN, historically, when they receive these kind of questions from people, they'll publish the answers, right? Mm-hmm. So if that's the case, they owe that to the community to publish that, because there's no way for anybody to have possibly known what somebody said on the Stossel show, right? So, I mean, it's that's one of the regulators' jobs, is to publish that information. So I appreciate you bringing that to light. The other question is, do they actually understand the role of miners in the Bitcoin community?
Correct.
And is that actually something that they're going to roll into some sort of official regulation or guidance? Or is that something that remains in a one-off email where they might be confused, right? So I certainly agree that it's subject to change, but as of now, I mean, it's the language in here is, in the actual guidance, says what it says.
So this brings up an interesting question for Jacob as the resident payments attorney. So if a miner registers with FinCEN, that comes with it certain reporting requirements like CTRs and SARs. If the miner's basic business is they plug machines into the wall, the machines produce Bitcoin, and they sell those Bitcoin on an exchange, and they don't know their counterparty, what should they report to FinCEN?
Ding, 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 ding. That's why it's a mess. And I'll answer your direct question in a minute, but I'm also going to take a middle position and say these guys were both right. You're right that the way the guidance defines what it's talking about, you can read it not to mean miners. But it's also true that if you look at the definition of money transmission, and I mentioned this earlier, because you're taking value as a miner, dollars, and you're sending somebody Bitcoins to another location, arguably under the definition, you are a money transmitter. And nobody really knows. I'd heard about this too. It really is a murky world, and clarification is probably necessary. One of the concerns is that, if you want to get the right ruling, you got to make the right request. So the industry should take that seriously, and it should go in a well thought out manner. There have been a couple kind of casual requests sent in, and you want to set yourself up to get the answer you want. So you just have to be cautious when you approach a regulator. You want to ask a question that you know what the answer you're going to get is. On your question, Ryan, the answer is nobody knows what you would report. You can't know when you're trading on an exchange who your counterparty is. It's how they work. As far as anybody can figure, you report the exchange as the counterparty. There's no better answer right now.
So I hate to do this. The conference guys just told me that we don't have time for audience questions, which really bums me out because we don't normally get this many high-quality experts here. But they've told me that all of the speakers, including myself, will be at the reception tonight and will be available to answer any questions. I love meeting virtual currency businesses. I love having them join my company as clients. And all of the other speakers are there too. I know both OpenCoin and Perkins Coie are also looking to meet you and answer your questions. So, and of course, Genesis Block would love to interview you, and the Mercatus Center needs donations. So please find us. Please ask us questions after, and we're looking forward to meeting you, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. And I'd really like to thank you guys for coming out.
Thanks for listening to this portion of our special Let's Talk Bitcoin conference coverage. Big thanks to Media Bistro for putting on a wonderful event at Inside Bitcoins. Stay tuned for more to come over the course of August. If you have any questions or comments for me directly, you can email adam@letstalkbitcoin.com. If you have questions, comments, or topic suggestions directed at the show broadly, please visit letstalkbitcoin.com/Reddit.